So, in part, the fog that's developed this term is the result of what's become, I think, almost an obsession with one very particular interpretation of civil society that comes largely from 19th century North America. This is civil society as a part of society, the world of voluntary associations, the non-profit sector, NGOs, and so on, forgetting that there are just as respectable, actually, earlier and later traditions of civil society thinking that have just as much to offer, but we've sort of forgotten them. So one of my aims is to bring them back into the conversation. And it was Alexis de Tocqueville, you've all heard of him, I'm sure, that started this romance when he visited the United States in the 1830s from France. And he saw America's rich tapestry of associational life as the key to its emerging democracy. That was the basic lesson that he drew. Americans of all dispositions, he said, have an incurable tendency to form voluntary associations. You can't stop them. They're amazing. As soon as you turn your back, they would have formed 3 more. And that tendency, that creative tendency of forming and pursuing collective action, he saw as the most important characteristic of revolutionary America. However, what he forgot, or perhaps what he simply didn't want to say, was that originally civil society did not mean that. It didn't mean the world of voluntary associations. Originally, at least from Aristotle to Thomas Hobbes, civil society represented an ideal type of society, a society characterized by certain values, ideals, principles, and achievements, the kind of society we as good citizens should be striving to create together and bequeath to those whom we love. And when you think about it, recognizing those big social ideals, political equality, peaceful coexistence, the abolition of poverty and discrimination, require action across and between many different institutions, not just voluntary associations, a point I'm going to illustrate a little bit later. And in that sense, civil society in the second school of thought is really used as a shorthand to describe a good society. We want to live in a civil society, a society that is civil, a society that is not racked by inequality and violence, but is one that we can be proud of. The society of our dreams, if you like. And most recently, philosophers have developed a third set of theories about civil society as what they call the public sphere, which, without becoming too academic about it, simply means the places where citizens argue with one another about the great questions of the day and negotiate a constantly evolving sense of the common or the public interest. What do we, as society as a whole, if that's ever possible, feel about the big issues of the day? Where do we want our society to head in the future? You have to have places where people can talk about and argue out their different visions, their different answers to that question. That's called the public sphere. So my starting point is to deconstruct what's become a very confused conversation about civil society, which mixes together and conflates elements of all of those 3 definitions. So to break it apart and then reconstruct a different synthesis, which I hope is more useful, actually, and certainly more accurate a description of how societies operate. So let me spend 2 minutes talking about each of those schools before I move to the point about synthesis. Let's take the Tocquevillians, the first school. They believe that voluntary associations act as what I would call gene carriers of the good society, microclimates, if you will, in which we develop values like tolerance and cooperation and the skills required for living a democratic life. We learn to be good citizens, according to this school of thought, through voluntary action in associations to which we belong. The trouble is that real associational life isn't actually like that. Certainly not in the place I live, in the United States. I suspect not here either, although New Zealand may be different. Real associational life is a battleground. It's home to all sorts of different and competing values and beliefs. Think pro and anti-choice groups, for example. Think the National Rifle Association versus the peace movement in the United States. And there's another similar problem with that thesis, and that is that the values and beliefs we want to see developed, because we think they're positive, are fostered in all the places where we learn and grow as individuals and where our dispositions are shaped through life. What does that mean? Families, schools, workplaces, firms, political parties, colleges, universities, and so on. So even if we want to develop those positive social attributes, they're not just going to be developed in voluntary associations. And we actually spend, most of us at least, unless we're a sort of serial volunteer, we spend most of our time in those other places, not in voluntary associations. So you might think that our experiences there will be especially important in forming our dispositions later in life. And for the same reason, by themselves, NGOs and other voluntary groups can't secure the level of political consensus that's required to secure and enforce broad-based social reforms. There's just too much diversity and difference of opinion. That's a good thing, because civil society in this sense is supposed to be the home of diversity and pluralism, the place where we can all find a place, as Benjamin Barber says, without having to ask for permission from anyone else. That's why civil society, to quote John Keane, is riddled with danger, because it gives freedom to despots and democrats alike. That's the simple reality, the truth of the matter. So that's why my second school of thought, civil society is the good society, is very important. Because what it does is it sets the contributions of voluntary associations in the wider context. And it guards against the tendency to privilege one part of society or one set of institutions over another on ideological grounds. Voluntary associations are more efficient than government, for example, or business is more efficient than both. You've heard that all the time. Good neighbours can't replace good government, and non-profits, I think, shouldn't be asked to substitute for well-functioning markets. That's not their role. Historically, if you think of East Asia after World War II, or Kerala and West Bengal more recently in India, or the experience of Chile, Botswana, or even China, I would say today, success in achieving those good society goals, poverty reduction and so on, has always been based on social contracts negotiated between government, business and citizens, not organised into a classic form of civil society, meaning independent of the state, but into semi-independent students' groups, local councils, professional associations and so on, exercising at least some level of accountability and functioning, however imperfectly, as bridges and information channels between citizens and government. As I put it in another book I wrote, Future Positive, the secret to development, it's the polity, stupid. Paraphrasing George Bush, it's not actually the economy, it's the polity that is the crucial issue in development. But if a good society requires coordinated action between these different institutions, all pulling in the same direction over a long period of time, which is the basic lesson, I think, of development experience, it leaves us with a question, and that brings us to theory number 3. How do societies decide in which direction they want to go, and whether it's the right one as conditions and circumstances change? How are collective choices made? How are trade-offs negotiated between different visions of the future? How are ends reconciled with means in ways that are just and effective? You can't answer those questions unless you consider civil society in its role as the public sphere, much neglected in the discourse of most development agencies. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time articulating it. To me, the concept of a public simply means a whole polity that cares about the common good and has some capacity to deliberate about it democratically. Some capacity. That's central, I think, to civil society thinking, because the development of shared interests, a willingness to cede some territory to others, the ability to see something of yourself in another group and work together to solve problems together. These are crucial attributes of any community, of any society that wants to survive into the future and solve problems for itself. So an effective public sphere in that sense is a crucial condition for the kind of governance and practical problem solving and the peaceful resolution of our differences that we're talking about here. So in its role as the public sphere, civil society becomes an arena for argument and deliberation, as well as for association and institutional collaboration, the two other theories. And the extent to which those public spaces thrive is crucial to democracy, because when you think about it, if only certain truths are represented, if alternative viewpoints are silenced by exclusion or suppression, we heard that, I think, this morning very loudly, or if one set of voices are heard more loudly than those of others, then by definition, there is no way to construct a genuine sense of the public interest, only a set of private interests fighting each other. When all politics are polarised, public policy problems become embedded or even frozen, it's a terrifying image, in policies that can never solve them. Think healthcare and welfare reform in the United States, for example, at the moment. Impossible to solve those problems because different positions have become frozen in the polity with no bridges between them, between the left and the right, between Democrat and Republican. Breaking the gridlock that results when you have that problem requires the creation of new publics in support of broad-based reform, and that's exactly what the United States is missing. So there's 3 schools of thought, all of which have something to offer, but by themselves they're incomplete and somewhat unconvincing. So I think the logical thing to do is to connect them so that the weaknesses of one set of theories are balanced by the strengths of the others. That's what I'm going to do next.